In front of us. I'm Jennifer Cook from York University. I'll be one of your chairs for this morning. Our first speaker is Mr. Doug Earle. In 2015, Doug began to talk about living with obesity as a panel member, speaking to first-year medical students at Dalhousie University. One of the other panel members nominated Doug for the Public Engagement Committee, and he has been a member since the summer of 2017. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Earle.
Good morning. I was asked to, address you about my life living with obesity. I was born in 1950, and I was heavy from the time I was born. All through school, I was the fat kid, but a little bit of teasing, but it wasn't anything terrible. And as I got through school, high school, there was talking to my doctors. He said you should be losing some weight, but not a lot of specifics. As I got into my 20s and 30s, I probably became a bit less active. But at 40 is when health issues started to affect me. I was a blood donor. And I was rejected for giving blood at the time because of my hypertension. And that's when I had to start going to a doctor and was medicated for hypertension. But again, I didn't change too much in my life. So that was back about 1990. With the hypertension and on the medication, I decided I was going to have to start doing something more. So I was living in Ottawa at that time, and I joined the recreation center. And I started doing regular exercises, gradually building up, doing water exercises and land exercises, group exercise class. And that was okay for a couple of years. And then one of the exercise classes, I came down with plantar fasciitis. I hurt my foot, and I almost couldn't do anything, couldn't even ride a stationary bicycle for a couple of years. And so the weight, lack of exercise, start coming on again. And just lost my train of thought, excuse me. The next stage, I guess, was in late 97. I got a job back in Halifax to head up the regional Y2K preparation. When I moved down there, I got away from my old routine. My friends, there was different, and I was going into a high-stress situation, and just out of the ordinary. I started eating a lot of fast food. Wasn't trying to take care, was away from exercise, and I gradually put on weight. And I was probably, before I started doing this, I was probably around 230, 240 pounds. By the little after the year 2000, I was getting up to 380, 400 pounds. And in, I think it was 2002, 2003, I found out I had to have a bowel resection because of polyps in my colon. And the doctor, or the surgeon, when I went to see him, and he explained the situation, and I had to sign that I had been receiving this information from him, and I noticed that the highest risk he had identified was that I was morbidly obese. I'd never heard that term before, so I asked the surgeon what was I assumed that's a medical term, and he explained what it was. And so he said, and I asked him, I said, so any weight I could lose before this surgery would be beneficial? And he acknowledged that. So I went through some weight loss programs, and I lost about 25 pounds in the next couple of months before the surgery. Went through the surgery, everything went well, but I didn't do anything more with the like weight loss or whatnot. And then but I just gradually got up, so I was late 2000s, I was back up to 400 pounds. And when I just turned after 60, I was going back for my yearly examination of the doctor and go over the blood work. And the doctor told me, he says, given the extent of my obesity, that I was hypertensive, and that I'm now 60, the indications are that by sometime in the next 10 years, I'm going to have a heart attack or a stroke. So while I was driving to this meeting, I happened to overhear Dr. Michael Vallis in Halifax talking about this new weight loss program they were starting up. And the thing I remember most about that radio interview was that part of this year-long program, you'd be on a liquid diet for 3 months. And when I first heard that, I couldn't imagine how anyone could possibly do that. But when the doctor told me this, I asked her about, I'd heard this, and was this a program she thought I should be part of? And she said, matter of fact, yes. And she had a patient that was already enrolled in this program, so she had some knowledge about the program. So in February 2011, I started on their second intake for the program. And that was a year-long program on the OptiPass for 3 months. Actually, it wasn't an issue. It quickly adapted, and food became a non-issue. I dropped about, I went from 380 pounds down about 310 pounds in that year. In November of 2011, I figured I was getting low, and I started going back to group exercise classes. And I continue that to this day. But within the next year, I noticed I was starting to get back into bad habits, and the weight was starting to come on again. So I redid that program again in 2013 and dropped about another 60, 70 pounds. I tried to make more of an effort afterwards to live the program and do all the things I had learned to make the changes more permanent. I was still having some difficulty afterwards, so I contacted the psychologist we had had part of the program. I saw her on an individual basis, and we worked on how to deal with urges or temptations in food. I went back to that same program for the 6-month one in 2015 because I picked up more skills, but I was starting to go back into bad habits again. So I went through that program in 2015, and I got down to about 245 pounds. And I put on about 20 pounds in the next few months, but I've kept, for the last 4 years, I've kept between 265 and 275 until last fall, when things started to go up again. And at Christmas time, I was up to 285 pounds, the heaviest I've been in a long, long time. That first 5 pounds came off fairly easy after Christmas, but then it plateaued. And but when I weighed myself last week, I was down to just below 280. So it's, I thought I had things under control, but it wasn't that. So I had to reinvigorate my effort and go back to some of the things I learned through those programs to try to maintain this weight loss. So it's a journey, and as part of this process, I had volunteered to participate. Anything that the people that sponsor the program, if they wanted to do, and one of the things they'd asked me to speak to 5 years ago, they asked me to speak to first-year medical students at Dalhousie about my life living with obesity, and I guess the response was, positive. So I've been doing that for the last 5 years, and as a result of a few years of that, one of the professors nominated me for why I'm here as part of the Public Engagement Committee of Obesity Canada, and I go around as an advocate for people living with obesity and different aspects of how what it's going to take for them to try to deal with their chronic disease. And that was one of the things, I didn't hear that till last year, that obesity is now considered a chronic disease, which means if you don't keep dealing with it, you don't keep addressing it, it'll only come back and progress, become worse. So I've been doing this, they call lifestyle management, and what I've learned is that people that try to maintain the weight loss through lifestyle management, 19 people out of 20 will fail in the long term, which is quite discouraging. And one aspect of trying to maintain a weight loss that I hadn't looked at too much was the use of medications. And my doctor had offered this to me, but I hadn't taken up on it. And self-reflection, I believe that's part of the internal bias that's wide in society and still internalized in me, that's an easy way out. Yet I have no qualms about taking medications for my hypertension. In the next few weeks, I'm scheduled to go back see my doctor, and I probably will look at starting to take Saxenda as a medication to help me deal with my obesity. So it's an ongoing journey. I've learned a lot as part of that process, and it's something I have to acknowledge and deal with for the rest of my life. Unless there's any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. My name's Kelly Isfan. I'm the late Kelly Isfan this morning, getting to the session to be co-moderator. And it's now my pleasure to introduce to you Hassan Vatanparast, who is Professor of Nutritional Epidemiology with an appointment for the College of Pharmacy and Nutrition and School of Public Health. Please help me welcome Dr. Vatanparast. And I do hope I didn't murder your name too badly.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the organizer for inviting me for this talk. So I'm going to be talking about at-risk population, immigrants and refugees. We haven't seen that much talk about this specific group. Somebody help me to navigate this. Oh, yeah, I got it. But before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that the work that I'm presenting is not just the sole work of me, definitely grad students, research assistants, my colleagues. Many co-investigators, around 30 co-investigators in different countries are working in the area of immigration health with me, and also definitely funding agencies. And I have no conflict of interest to declare. The learning outcomes for this talk, it's going to be a very short talk. Definitely I can't cover many areas, but I'm going to be giving you an idea on what's the nutritional health of new Canadians with focus on young population, children. And we are using newcomers as a general term, but we have two specific groups, immigrants and refugees. I like to see if we can recognize the differences that they have in terms of risks that they have, and also comparing them with Canadian children, how healthy they are. And I'll do that through our Healthy Immigrant Children study. Why immigrants? If you look at the statistics, I'm going to quickly go through this. Millions of people are displaced around the globe, and it's sad to see that in 2017, in the history of human beings, we had the highest number of refugees. You see the numbers, 22 million people in 2017, and then there are more forced displacement. And looking at the status and forecasts for future, we will have more and more refugees, and this is really not a good situation that we are dealing in a global perspective and also at national perspective. So what's the role of Canada? Canada has that tradition of welcoming newcomers, and basically Canada is built upon immigration. Looking at the stats in Canada, 1 in 5 Canadians are born outside Canada. Just in between 2018 and 2020, we will have around 1 million newcomers to Canada. And again, you see the projection 2031 that 28% of the population are going to be foreign-born. Why is it important? If you look at this graph, I like to follow the dark blue part. So initial settlers in Canada were mainly from Europe and Britain. And then you see how over time that part has shrinked. And then the projection up to I don't see the numbers in here. Say if you look at the projected values, you see that dark blue part is shrinking and shrinking. On the other side, we have people from different countries, different cultural backgrounds are coming to Canada. So it really increases the cultural diversity in here. What's the implication for us as the people involved in health in different perspectives is that, well, basically culture has a role in defining how healthy you are. And statistics in Canada shows that if you are non-European immigrants to Canada, the chances of moving from good health to poor health is much higher than European immigrants to Canada. So there is something happening related to the culture, related to language, and so on. Let's differentiate immigrants from refugees right from the beginning. Those who are immigrants, basically, they have a choice to. They are affluent, they have the language skills, they have the credentials, and they pick to live wherever they want and then apply for immigration. So they are ready to move. Refugees, no, they don't have that choice. That's forced replacement. There are many different situations that you have seen, war, natural disasters, and so on, that are creating refugee asylum-seeking situation. This is an example of what you see in the media. There are many people, imagine mainly from rural areas, less educated. They are not ready to move. They just have, you see, the lady that has just a pack on her shoulder. That's the only thing that they can carry when they come. So they are not ready to adopt the new culture, new environment, and then the consequences are coming after. You may have heard there are different theories. Healthy immigrant effect is something that has been placed for a while now. Immigrants to Canada, at the beginning, they are healthier. By time, their health status is declining up to the host country population. Why this is happening? Challenges with the adopting new culture, if you look at the literature, the stress that they have had throughout their journey and in the new country, acculturation that is happening, and the way that they have been defining health through their culture, now it has been changed. And then perhaps more access to healthcare system when they come to Canada that allows to identify new diseases and so on. So these are reasons that you can find in literature. But there is a selective process by the government of Canada. So there is a medical screening process for immigrants, not for refugees, that usually that kind of selections perhaps is one explanation that those who are coming are healthy. Also, different categories of immigration, if you look at them, you see that family class, economy class, skilled workers. These are healthy people, middle-aged, young people that are coming to Canada. Again, the fact is that their health status is declining, even within 2 years, within 4 years, moving from good health to poor health is triples. Looking at the objective measures, many types of diseases, you see that there is a sharp decline in their health status. So why this is happening? You may have heard this term a lot, acculturation. So basically, they are adopting with the new culture in Canada. There are different models explaining how acculturation is happening. I personally like the alteration or bicultural model because it's more comprehensive, that there is says that there is a possibility that you belong to 2 or 3 different cultures. Pick and choose the ones that are more relevant to the way that you like to live. But no matter how acculturation is explained, when you are coming to a new environment with different culture, there is conflict, anxiety that comes with it, and you need to deal with that. So imagine a newcomer comes to Canada, there is a honeymoon period, they are so happy that, well, basically if they are refugees living that disastrous situation, those who are immigrants, they are happy that this is the goal, this is the place that I picked to come, and I studied on that. And then, but all of a sudden, that kind of cultural shock is happening, or what I have been gained and what I lost by coming to Canada. And we have many newcomers or immigrants that are staying in that kind of some degrees of that cultural shock within years, not just a few months. And then after that, there is adjustment. So This is happening, and then this causes some health issues, mental health and physical issues for newcomers. Dietary acculturation, this is another term, the process by which immigrants are adopting dietary practice of the host country. The picture that you see is one of the sessions that we have with newcomers going through the old food guide right now, Hassan. And yeah, so their diet is changing. And, but at the same time, we should not ignore the role of nutrition transition, because many of the newcomers to Canada have already been exposed to this culture through their home. You can barely find a place that there is no McDonald's in it. There is no Coca-Cola, or there is no KFC. And yeah, so the challenge is that dietary acculturation is happening much more in children. They are assimilating to the new culture much faster. Traditional food items are expensive, unavailable. You know the main elements of Western food that needs to be decreased, so high fat, sugar, and salt. For newcomer children, they are easily influenced by that through peer and so on. We have, in qualitative part of our study, we have many expressions how they are rejecting the traditional food that they have. Newcomer parents, they value the convenience and easy preparation. So for children back home, say KFC or McDonald's was fancy food. It was really expensive. I have seen in different countries, but right now it's the cheapest food that they can buy. So it's just attractive to them, and then parents, because back home only one parent was working, right now both of them should work to take care of the cost of life, then on the way back home, just grab something that kids are happy with it. So that's the best choice that they can make. What's the consequence? Is chronic conditions. Looking at two different studies, you see, I'm not going to go through all of it, but starting from obesity goes to different type of physical illnesses and also mental health issues. So definitely acculturation is giving them something that perhaps they do not deserve, kind of acculturating to Western kind of culture and lifestyle. Now, going through what is more relevant to this conference, prevalence of overweight obesity at the beginning is higher, is similar or higher, is similar or actually lower, but the longer they stay in here is going to be higher in immigrants. For refugee children, in our own study, we found that there is some rate of stunting. So we had around, say, less than 10% of stunting, which was, again, surprise for us to find stunting in here. But within a few years, again, obesity, overweight is taking over. And why this is happening comes back to transition to Western diet and moving away from their traditions and so on. Factors that affect obesity among newcomers: age, the younger the age, the more chance for getting contracted with obesity. Ethnicity, we see that in Latin Americans and Caribbeans in Canada is happening faster. In Asians is the lowest. Education, the higher education, the less chance. Diet, but definitely adopting Western diet has impact on it, and physical inactivity. So I'm going to go to consequences of obesity, two of them, and then I'll go to our healthy immigrant children study. At the beginning, healthy newcomers, the rate is lower. Risk factors, again, are obesity, hyperlipidemia, hypertension, again, the type of food that immigrants have. The challenge that we have in immigrant population is that they are hesitant to go and seek for help. One of the reasons is they are not able to take care of the cost of care. So they have that universal kind of healthcare plan, but when it comes to medication and so on, in very early years of arrival, because they are on survival mode, no major source of income, then they have trouble with seeking for help and getting medication and so on. The other consequence that we see is obesity. South Asians are fastest growing population in Canada. It was surprising first time that I saw that it's happening 10 years, diabetes happening 10 years earlier in them. There are different theories why this is happening. Genetic predisposition is one of them, kind of keeping to some degree the same type of diet that they have, but lifestyle is different. So if they were living on land, agriculture, high demanding physical activity way of life, now moving to a kind of living in an apartment and sedentary lifestyle, perhaps this is one of the reasons. When it comes to receiving treatment, again, they have challenges like language barrier, low rate of literacy, and poor compliance with lifestyle changes. This paper is an important paper published 4 days ago, and basically linking CCHS data with immigration, so with the Ministry of Immigration, Citizenship, and Refugee, I forgot the name, IIRC. They have landing data for immigrants. So what they did, Edward Nick and his colleague did, they merged the two data sets so that they can look at them over time, what is happening. The first set of bars that you see are Canadians, and then based on the duration of the stay, we have 0 to 3 years in immigrants, and then 4 to 9 years, and then over 10 years. As you see, the one that I circled is those recent immigrants. They are in Canada less than 3 years. Looking at to their BMI, that's overweight and obesity, and chronic diseases by chronic disease A means that kind of mild chronic disease like asthma, like low back pain, and so on. And chronic diseases B are those that are more serious, like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and so on. You see that most recent immigrants, the prevalence of obesity, chronic diseases, and low self-reported health is significantly lower than any other categories. In men, as the duration of the stay increases, it's getting much closer to Canadian population. In women, the same story we see, but the rates are lower than in men. Now, looking at literature, a few years ago, we noticed that whatever we have regarding healthy immigrant effect and what is happening for newcomers is about adults. We don't have that much data on children. So we ran that study in children, comprehensive study with lots of physical measures, quantitative and qualitative. That's a mixed method design explanatory, and to see what is happening in them. Sample 300 children, fair distribution between immigrants and refugees, and also in terms of male-female distribution, the same story. This is Health Eating Index Canada, again, based on the old food guide. The point of surprise for us was that refugees, 14% are in poor category. You see that there is not that much different, and we compared our study data with Canadian children, similar age groups, through CCHS, Canadian Community Health Survey. Not that much difference in need for improvement category. Now, inadequate index of, again, old food groups. If we consider fruit and vegetable as an index of high quality food, you see that very high percentage of immigrant refugees, they do not meet the requirements. Milk and alternative, the same story. Now, I picked only 4 nutrients in here to show you what's the status. For calcium, this is prevalence of inadequacy. Immigrant refugees, you see 79 to 82%, while Canadian children, 23% prevalence of inadequacy. Goes to vitamin D is really high, but we had similar status in those years for Canadian children, the same age group. What is again concerning for us is zinc, because zinc is a very important nutrient for growth and development, 36% prevalence of inadequacy. Vitamin D has totally different stories, really concerning. We had 29% of refugee children, they were vitamin D deficient. We did run a study looking into CHMS, Canadian Health Measure Survey. Canadian children compared with our children, we noticed that immigrant children, mainly girls, are much more at risk. Physical activity, 13% of participants did not meet the recommended dose of physical activity. And when it comes to sedentary activity, you see almost half of refugee children, more than 2 hours sedentary activity, 33% in immigrants. When we go to qualitative data for all of these data points that I'm sharing with you, we have explanation to what we are hearing from service providers, healthcare service providers, and also from the parents. And this is another concern that I have. Canadian Community Health Survey, we have food security status measured. You see that in the middle part, you see general population, immigrant population, using national survey data. 12% for general population, 15% for immigrants. We use the same tool, and if you look at to the right side of the graph, we have healthy immigrant children study. In refugees, 62%, in immigrants, Also, we have another study going on Syrian refugees, recent Syrian refugees. We see how high is prevalence of inadequacy, prevalence of food insecurity. We use the same tool as StatsCan does. Why we have such difference? Because the first thing that the StatsCan does, those who are speaking in English or French, they are excluded from, those who cannot speak in English or French, they are excluded from the study. Basically, they are excluding the main people that have problem with integrating in Canadian society. And also, there is no way of distinguishing between immigrants and refugees in national survey data. So we did that, and we noticed that refugees are much more at risk. And we have had communication with Health Canada, Stats Canada. We really need to know what is happening at national level. Why? Because we have many studies shown that food insecurity is associated with many chronic diseases, starting from cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and so on. So in future, these kids, they will be providing more demand, to our healthcare system, because they're going to be contracting chronic diseases much faster. Comes to overweight, obesity. Overweight, you see the prevalence is around 22%. The same year, we had 25% among Canadian children and 30% or 28% in Saskatchewan children through CCHS data. Why? We see that it's very close to them. So again, it explains that they have already been exposed to Western diet and lifestyle in their home country. Again, another concerning results that we found was cholesterol level. You see in refugee children, we have 28% of them, they have high level of cholesterol. So it's, again, it has some consequences compared to Canadian children that we really don't have anybody in that high level. Going to why this is happening, looking at to their data intake data comes to the choices that they have in terms of fast food and processed foods. There are many other things that I like to share, but I'm going to be stopping here. Imagine that this situation is happening to them. They're going to be at risk of chronic diseases. At the same time, they have barriers toward accessing healthcare services. Why? Because they are losing their social network. They are coming here. We have communities right now with Syrian refugees, two Syrian refugee families in a rural community. The only people that they can communicate is themselves. They don't know knowledge of English language and so on, and they are relying on their kids to pick up the language from school and then come and then be their interpreter. You have heard what is happening these days in Alberta regarding that 9-year-old kid that committed suicide because of bullying in the school system. So I don't know if you are following the news. Comes back to a major issue that we have, culturally appropriate care, no matter in its health or comes to the services in the school system and so on. There is a de-skilling process, looking at immigrants based on the scoring system that Canada has, Immigration Canada has. There are physicians, engineers, and so on. They are coming to Canada, but going to accreditation bodies, their degree is not recognized. They need to go through a process. It takes around 5 years to be, say, for a physician, to pass all those kind of stages to be able to practice in here. So only some of them can pass those. The rest are going to be delivering pizza and so on. So again, that skilling process is happening very fast. Language barrier, a major problem. There are many stories when we talk about this with our in qualitative part with families and so on. This is one of the major problems that they have. And cultural competence in healthcare provider, again, has considered as one of the major challenges that they have. Just to wrap up, newcomer families might be at risk of experiencing many health issues. When it comes to children, particularly in refugees, they have high risk of food insecurity, high prevalence of vitamin D deficiency, inadequacy. Their current dietary practices not providing adequate intake of the food that they need for their growth and development. There is a high prevalence of overweight, obesity. And the situation might be much worse in Syrian refugees because we had influx of them. We had around 47,000 of them within 18 months, and it was huge. And I don't think that Canada has recent experience taking this many refugees in that short period of time. Again, comes back to providing care. We need to consider the element of culturally appropriate care. Thank you for your attention. Is there any time for questions? Or?
No.
No? Okay.
Okay,
good.
sorry.
Thank-
Yeah, so sorry, I've been tasked to keep you on schedule, and so you can save any questions that you have for Dr. Vatanparast for the coffee break after the session. So our next speaker is Dr. Alexander Crizzle. He is a gerontologist and assistant professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Saskatchewan. His research interests are within the domain of transportation, community mobility, and program evaluation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Crizzle.
So I just press the button to move forward here.
You're here to help.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So I just press this button to go forward, right? Yes. Okay. Sorry, I'm technology inclined. So just want to make sure I have this well, and I'm missing my presentation. There we go. So I'm going to be co-presenting here with Gord Zello. So I'm going to start by providing the context around this issue, and then Gord will take it home showing the results from our study. And this is the first presentation that we're actually showing these results, so we're quite excited to be here. Oops, there we go. Nope. There we go. So just before I start, I just want to acknowledge the team. We were on the road for almost 2 months collecting data in Alberta and Saskatoon, and being on the road constantly is time-consuming and also very challenging. So I just want to thank the team, specifically Miriam and Jennifer, who are a postdoc and a graduate student, now a master's student, who really helped us with a lot of the data collection. So just wanted to acknowledge them and their time, and we wouldn't be here without them. So truck driving is a very common occupation. If you look at Statistics Canada, they'll show data that there's about 1 million commercial motor vehicle drivers. So there's a lot of them, but the definition is very broad. So this can include long-haul truckers, short-haul truckers, dump trucks, tow trucks, and even bus drivers. But the group that we're really interested in is the long-haul truck drivers, because they're the ones who tend to be away from home and exposed to many other environmental conditions that can influence their health and wellness. And that's really what we're interested in, is their health and wellness. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the impact of those environments on health in this project. And for some odd reason, this does not want to go forward at all. There we go. So in terms of long-haul truckers, we have about 300,000 of them in Canada. It's the second most common occupation, specifically among men, behind retail sales. So men are typically employed in these positions throughout Canada, but usually from this group, and I've just gone to the next slide, but 95% of the sector is actually with men. Despite having 300,000 truckers in Canada, there's a large shortage. There's a great need for more truckers, and if you think about what truckers do, you know, they take a lot of the goods and produce all over Canada to certain destinations, and there's not going to be any replacement. I know we hear about the impact of potentially driverless trucks, not going to happen anytime soon, so that's why we see such a large push for recruitment. If you think about being a truck driver and what their job entails, their workday usually spans anywhere from 16 to 17 hours, depending on the routes that you're driving. And of those, say, 16 hours, you have to drive 13 hours of the day. So you have 3 hours for breaks, and that's about it. And if I were to tell you that you get paid per mile driven, you're probably going to drive as many miles as you possibly can because you want to earn as much money. And just to give you context, a typical truck driver gets paid anywhere between 28 cents and 40 cents per mile. So they're not getting a lot. So if they can push 1,000 miles a day, which is maybe unrealistic in a 13-hour day, they're not getting a lot of money for it. And so this definitely has an impact on what they're able to do when they're on the road in terms of purchasing healthy foods, even in terms of getting out of the truck and exercising. So if you're in a truck for 13 hours, you're fairly sedentary because you're not moving. You might be exposed to quite a bit of vibration in the truck, so you might have some low back pain. You have access to maybe unhealthy foods because you can't afford it. You might be fairly fatigued because you're in a truck and you can't move, and you're just driving. And so these kind of factors kind of compound. And a lot of truckers, if you didn't know, they don't get paid for their loading and unloading time. But they do have to load and unload their own trucks. So they're also at high risk for a lot of musculoskeletal disorders. And in fact, it's the leading group for workers' compensation claims in Canada. And indeed, when you put all these together, truck drivers have a high risk for many risk factors, including hypertension, they have sedentary behaviors, decreased physical activity, and this leads to an increase in potentially chronic conditions such as diabetes and obesity, and that's what we're really focused on today. So indeed, it's actually what we found. The literature shows that truck drivers have high rates of hypertension, not just hypertension, many are actually being treated for cholesterol. Studies have found, actually all the studies that are being conducted in North America have found that more than 50% of the samples are obese. So again, many of them are quite large. The range of diabetes is actually relatively small, 6 to 14%, but it's still much higher than the Canadian population. There's a wide range of smokers, anywhere from 32 to 55%. And truck drivers will smoke as a form to keep themselves awake in the car or in the truck. In addition to having coffee and maybe some energy drinks, smoking is a common mechanism. Just to be able to operate your truck and to just be awake. And again, sleep problems is fairly prevalent. More than 50% report being fatigued. We're not reporting it here, but more than a third of our truck drivers have actually reported dozing off, which is quite scary when you think about all the truckers that are on the road. I'm not sure if you want to be beside one of them. I don't. So the data that we have currently is all based in the US. We actually don't have too much information on Canadian truckers. There's been a few studies that have been done primarily in Ontario that have had relatively small samples. And so typically what we've done as a country, we've used the American data, and there's quite a bit of contextual differences. One, our hours of service regulations are quite different. So we drive a lot more here. So we're 16 hours or 17 hours again, depending on the routes. It's much less in the States. We have different geographies in terms of Ice Road Truckers. Anyone seen that show? So we have to drive in different environments, and we have a different population. So we have many new immigrants who are coming into the trucking sector. So we might see more truckers from maybe an Indian nature or who are African American. And in the States, we see a lot more who are African American and specifically Hispanic, especially in the Southwest. So we can actually use the American data to develop our policies and programs, but that's what we've been doing. And so the purpose of our study was to actually collect data on Canadian truckers to actually show, are they similar or different, and where are the opportunities to actually improve our trucking sector. And not just in a contextual form, but also for the truckers' environment and even their workforce policies. So our study was funded by the Alberta government, their occupational health and safety branch, and we went on the road in Alberta as well as Saskatoon, and we collected data for almost 2 months. And we would actually go to the truck stops, specifically Husky and Flying J, and we would actually do several study components. We would give them a survey, which was fairly long. It was almost 45 pages. So we got a lot of information on their health and wellness and working environments. And we also followed up with objective health assessments where we'd measure their blood pressure. We would do skin fold measurements, grip strength, biometric impedance, and we'd also do a dietary recall, looking at what they've had in the past day. And if they weren't tired after that, we'd ask them to do an interview. And that would also last anywhere from 20 minutes to sometimes an hour because they were quite chatty. So we learned a lot of information from this group, and we're going to be sharing some of that. I'm going to turn it over to Gordon 1 minute, but in terms of how many people we recruited 232, which is now the largest study in Canada in this group. We collected health measurements on 216, and we conducted 92 interviews. So just in terms of being able to enter all the data, specifically analyze the data, 92 interviews is a lot to analyze. So we have lots of interesting nutritional information. So in terms of our sample, average age is around 50 years. We had a wide range, anywhere from 23 to 89. So there are a lot of truckers who are older and on the road, but most of them really do fall within that 40 to 60 category. And again, 96.5% were men and 70% were Caucasian. So again, this is actually quite a bit different from the States. In the States, you'll have maybe about 80% who are Caucasian, and the rest might be Hispanic or from another group. So we have a little more diversity in our sample. In terms of our measurements, BMI, blood pressure, and grip strength that I'm showing here were measured objectively. So in terms of risk categories, we can actually see that more than 50% were in the high risk and very high risk categories. So again, more than 50% of our samples are obese. In terms of blood pressure, the average was 146 in terms of systolic pressure and 91 diastolic. So again, blood pressure tends to be quite high. And again, the highest we measured was 221. Crazy. In terms of grip strength, the average was 45.5. And Gord will actually tell you what these means in terms of percentiles and how they actually fit against Canadian norms. And again, we had more than 50% who were fairly sedentary in their physical activity. They weren't able to get out of the truck, they weren't able to exercise, and they would actually consider their loading or unloading part of their job as part of their activity. So again, they weren't very active and they didn't get their usual amount of physical activity that they should be getting. So at this point, I'm going to just talk about this last slide before I turn it over. So what I wanted to show here is on the left-hand side is the data from our truck study. The middle column is from the Canadian Community Health Survey, where we're actually looking at Canadian norms, or just a general population, and then within that population, they had a subset of truckers. So these truckers, is on the right-hand side, there's 990. And you can see that what we found in our study was that BMI is much higher than what is reported in our Canadian Common Health Survey. So we can't really use that data at this point to really inform issues in our sector. We know they're quite high, we just didn't think they're going to be this much higher. Even in terms of diabetes, 15% of our population had diabetes, which is quite high, again, to Canadian norms. Same with hypertension. We had a large group, again, that were inactive. We also had a much higher prevalence of cancer in our sample, 13%, and heart disease is fairly comparable. So again, our sector is very much at risk for all sorts of conditions. So I'll stop rambling and I'll turn it over to Gord to take it home.
Thanks, Alex. So I'm going to focus on the nutrition part. Again, Alex is the public health person and I'm the nutrition person, so it's a great combination for this study. So looking just at food consumption here, you can see, so the questions were fairly simple. So with regards to fruits, it was just, do you eat fruits in a day? It wasn't how much you eat, it was do you eat? So there was, a group, 60% that said they ate fruit, but that means there were 40% in a day that did not have any fruit or vegetable, well, fruits. With regards to sugar-sweetened beverages, a large percent, and then again, coffee consumption, which again brings the idea of being awake into play. We looked at where they eat. So first of all, fast food in truck stops, as well as fast food not in truck stops. And you can see again, very high percentage are eating in these environments that don't have very good food choices. Looking at other variables, so here we've got at the top by least risk and to very high risk. This is based on BMI, and within each of these groups, what the risk factors are. So basically what we're showing here is that even those that are defined as least risk by BMI, they still have practices and conditions that are not healthy. So they too have not a lot of exercise, they have high blood pressure, and they are also eating at, environments that don't have necessarily good food choices. There is a slight change when you go to those that have BMIs at the very high risk. So here's some pictures of what you see in a truck stop. So you can see here, most of you, if you go to a 7-Eleven or so, you'd see this stuff. But here you can see, again, very important component of their intake, which is high energy drinks. Again, not only do these drinks contain caffeine, they're also very high caloric and full of free sugars. This is an interesting slide that got me a little bit concerned, but also somewhat not surprised. Where you can see on the slide here, you can see the different sizes of pop, and the cost is the same for the super large as well as a small pop. So 2 points here. If you're if you're going to have a choice, the cost is the same. You're going to probably, for value, pick the larger. And also, it tells us that the food industry makes their money at that small cup. They don't care if you're taking the big amount because they've already made their money on the small cup. One of the interesting proxies we used here is grip strength, which relates to muscle mass as well as muscle strength. And you can see here with regards to the Canadian norms, you can see here that the percentiles for our truck drivers throughout the ages, and especially as they get older, their grip strength is much less than the Canadian population, so their percentile is low. And you might think that's what you wouldn't expect from truck drivers, but again, remember they're sitting during the day and they're doing very little muscular work. So that brings us to the end. I should say we're on a moving target in the sense that we're still analyzing a lot of our data, especially that 45-page survey data. These truck drivers clearly have unhealthy drinking and eating behaviors. They have a high rate of chronic disease, and we're seeing as the truckers are in the business, if you like, for longer periods of time, their health risks go up. So where are we? We're looking at the fact that these truckers have unhealthy lifestyle practices. The environment they're in actually is probably one of the major issues of concern. This certainly means, and we're starting to see that, there's got to be more attention at both the community level and government policy with regards to truck drivers. As Alex said, this is a major industry as well as employment. Finally, I think most importantly is that we do have a food environment that we know is maybe not the healthiest, and truck drivers are exposed to even worse environments than even us. And just that little slide there at the bottom, you can see how much one orange costs, one banana costs. So again, cost becomes one of the issues. So I think we have like 1 minute for questions.
Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah, can you please use the mic? Thanks, Christy. Okay. Oh.
Thank you for that. So I guess not entirely surprising that the lifestyle is not ideal in these long-haul truckers. So where do you start?
I think there's many different approaches, but I don't think a single approach is the answer. The first approach is obviously, health promotion, educating the truckers. Not so much though on diet, but maybe other ways that they can eat healthy foods on the road. So whether that's a fridge in their truck, whether it's a little microwave or an opportunity to be able to cook their own foods in the truck. So that might be the route to go because they have the information, but they don't have access to the healthy foods because they can't stop to get them. And with their low income, they can't buy them. They can't afford to buy them. So, I mean, it's very much cheaper for them to buy chips, pop, because it's affordable for them, and they're in a rush. They don't have time to sit down. So if you can actually get them to be able to maybe make their own foods and be able to pack their own foods and have that in the truck so that they can eat when they're done their shift, that might be an opportunity. But other than that, it's really, how do we get better food quality to these truckers? And that's really, coming back to the truck stops. It's coming back to what's provided to them, even in terms of rest stops, so that they can better stop and get access to it.
And just to quickly add to that, even though, the truck stops where they purchase most of the food, it's actually quite expensive, as you could see from the fruit and vegetables. But also, the low-quality foods, the high-caloric foods are much more expensive in that situation than you would get at a grocery store. Truckers can't stop because they've got these big rigs. One trucker said he drove through Tim Hortons because they said they wouldn't serve him unless he drove through the drive-through, so he did with his long-haul truck. I think he took a few things out while he did that. But yeah, so that's certainly a big concern. The last point to that is that probably the best place to start are with the new drivers, especially with the regulations coming in for training. It's probably a really good opportunity to talk to them about lifestyle. So that's hopefully something that goes forward, because most truckers, when they start, don't necessarily have these bad practices. They learn them on the road.
Is
Thank
there
you.
time for my question?
Unfortunately, you can save them for the coffee break. That's just after the session. So let's.
Thank you both. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Francois Haman, who will talk to us about a topic that I'm personally really interested in, having worked across northern Canada about our land-based foods, a solution for the obesity crisis in remote First Nation communities in Ontario. So welcome and thank you.
It's kind of interesting that we're talking about different population now, but the concepts are very similar, as you guys are going to see. So it's kind of interesting to see that we're in a food crisis in Canada for certain populations. So I'm co-presenting right now with Nigel Orr, who's a Cree student from Northern Quebec. He works in health sciences, amazing student. Sylvia Santosa, CRC in clinical nutrition, and Michael Robidoux, who's an ethnologist, who actually brought me into the First Nation work. I just want to acknowledge that we're in traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And so my talk will focus a lot on food, but I just want to cover some of the basic, and I'm not going to go through statistics too much, but we all know this, the prevalence of obesity within First Nation communities are amazingly high. It is higher within on reserve. But what's even more concerning, every time I go up north, what I find amazingly concerning to me is the fact that we observe type 2 diabetes at very young ages. So this is actually from 1997. I could tell you that this trend is probably going down even lower now. So 15 years ago, this was not my main field of research. So Michael Robidoux approached me and he said, "Do you want to start working on the obesity crisis and diabetes crisis within First Nation communities?" So again, I had a very romantic idea coming from a French-Canadian culture about hunting and fishing, and I thought it was going to be awesome and really cool. It was awesome and really cool, but really shocking to see the situation that we have within Canada. We developed a group, which is the Indigenous Health Research Group, and we developed a model called the Beaver Model, Benefits, Viability, and Risks. And we look extensively on land-based solutions. We've been funded throughout the years with different initiatives. So what I'm going to touch on today is kind of a very small portion of it, and it's actually super new, right off the press. Just did the calculations probably 2 days ago. So I think it's going to be exciting to see some of these calculations. We worked in very many communities, Inuit communities in Northern Quebec, and we worked across Canada. So one thing I really want to be emphasizing is that we cannot make blanket statements about First Nation communities. Every single First Nation community is going to have their own challenges. Some of them are common, but the environment is different and living conditions are different. And I'll give you one example of this. If you go into coastal areas of BC, I've actually we worked in Telegraph Creek where there was 3 species of salmon migrating through every year. The amount of fish that we caught within 4 days are in the hundreds. And it's called the Serengeti of Canada, so they have access to moose and a lot of different animals. The area where I'm going to be talking about today is the one that is even way more challenged in terms of this was a nomadic area where people used to move around. They were brought there by the fur trade, and they were actually moving around throughout the territory, and they were put on reserve. These are inland remote communities. These communities are within the Anishinaabe Nation, and just to contextualize, I've given this talk in Switzerland, so that's why I still have the Switzerland reference, is that their territory, which is within Treaty Number 9, which was created in 1905, is 13 times the size of Switzerland, and there's 50 communities. Some of the communities are as small as 40 people, others can be as high as 4,000 people. In these communities, we're talking about ice road truckers. In these communities, in the winter, they do have access to trucks when the winter road is open, and everybody that saw the show knows how dangerous it is. Or the food will be flown in. And as we all know, flying in food means cost by weight. So it's amazingly expensive to bring the food in. The other solution that a lot of people have been focusing on is land-based solution, and people have been thinking that this is the main solution to deal with some of the food crisis within these communities. Some of the work I'm going to be showing is within 2 communities that actually at some point were one and were separated into 2. So Wapakika, Angling Lake in English, and Casabonica First Nation. Wapakika is 440 of population, and Casabonica 791. Within these communities, we did a study back in 2007, and we looked at the prevalence of obesity, and as you can see, it's as high, obesity and overweight, as high as 90% in adults. And the prevalence of diabetes is about 5 to 6 times higher than the Canadian average, at around 30 to 40% in women. But it becomes, in any community, what do we do with the food issue? And I've kind of developed a concept almost 10 years ago, which is the dietary dilemma. What do you eat within these communities? And this is a challenge that we face every time we go up, and every time we send students up. What do we do? Do we bring food up, or do we buy food that is available? So some of the food that is available, of course, and we're all looking for this, is the nutritious non-processed foods. Better quality protein, good quality protein and fats, better carbohydrates, contains fiber, minerals, vitamins. The big issue is they have a very low shelf life. So a lot of the stores don't want to send it up because they're worried that people will not buy it. The prices are ridiculous. They're totally out of price. Their availability, and you can see on the right-hand side a picture of what the healthy section looks like. So generally, when people think that people are not making the choice to buy it, that's not really the case. There's so little going up that people will jump on it and buy it, even though it's expensive and doesn't stay on the shelves, but there's so little of it. There's also a problem, and that's kind of on the cultural sense, and it kind of relates back to the first talk. Culturally, there's a lack of knowledge into food preparation of certain specific foods because people are not used to eating them. So even if some foods are brought up, people might not know what to do with them. The other food, which is, if you want to get the most for the buck, is definitely processed fast foods. So if you want to feed a family, you will get way more for the buck in these First Nation communities. So if you look at some of the cost, they're actually fairly well priced, and people can afford them fairly well. They generally engineer to taste good, so kids will love them. And they're easy to prepare, highly available, and they're amazing shelf life. So you can basically keep them for months on the shelves. Of course, the cons is that you're getting bad quality fats, you're getting bad quality proteins, you got tons of refined sugars, and I'll show you some data on this. High salt, preservatives, and additives. So that basically leaves us, if we know there's very little nutritious food, there's tons of junk food which we're trying to remove from the diet, basically leaves us with land-based foods. So we're getting good quality protein, we're getting a good quality fat, keeping in mind that meat, wild meat, is amazingly lean. The fattiest meat is whale at 7% fat. So there's very little fat within wild meat. So you need to harvest the fat. You harvest it from blubber, or you harvest it from whatever tissue you want to harvest it from. So if it's not being harvested, there's actually very little fat in wild meat. There's no refined sugars, and there's a big concept of cultural empowerment, and you can see the kids, how proud they are every time to show you the fish or to go see the grandmother preparing a beaver that they're going to eat later on. The challenge is the cost, and I won't have time to go through this, but the costs are even more than what you would pay for nutritious foods. The risks, the effort of hunting and fishing, and for people that have done it, know how much work it is to go hunting and fishing. But there's also the knowledge around food preparation and food conservation, which is basically held by the elders, and a lot of these elders have been to residential schools, and a lot of this knowledge has been lost. So people are rediscovering in certain communities some of this knowledge. So we did a study just to look at the effect of land-based foods, which I call wild food here, on the prevalence of type 2 diabetes and obesity. And we use very many markers to be able to identify what people are eating. Again, what people forget is we're still in Ontario, but some of the elders barely speak English. So we need to work with a translator, which generally we ask a question that takes 5 minutes, and we get an answer back that takes in 1 word. So, and then we try to figure out what is actually going on. So we wanted to use some of the interview data, but we also use food questionnaires. But we also use objective measures, and I'll show you some of the objective measures. And then we wanted to look at this dietary difference on the incidence of obesity and type 2 diabetes. We were able to recruit, which doesn't seem like a lot, but is actually a lot in these communities, 40 volunteers, which represents 20% of the adults in Wapkika and 50% of the adults in Casablanca. We used isotopes, and we used fatty acid, and I'm just going to show you the isotope and fatty acid data. So through the interviews, we identified the people that ate wild food less than once a month. And believe it or not, that actually exists in these communities. Some people do not like wild food. And at the other extreme, you would have people that eat it twice a week, at least twice a week. And if we look at store-bought markers versus land-based markers, what we can see, so I use C13, and everybody knows that C13 is highly present in refined sugars. I use C13 as a marker of store-bought food, and also 18.2, which is a store-bought food that's used in the process of developing processed foods. And you can see that there's a dramatic difference between people that eat wild food just once a month, less than once a month, and people that eat it twice a week. The other marker we use to confirm this, that people were eating land-based, and the fish markers are the easiest to use. N15 is an amazing marker of fish consumption because it bioaccumulates in fish. And what we can see is people that eat more wild food are eating a lot of fish. And the other fatty acid, which is only found in fish, is 22,6 DHA. And that 22,6, again, much higher. So we can see that we have a difference between the people that don't eat a lot of wild food and people that eat more wild food. If we look at the incidence of diabetes and obesity, there's no difference. The only difference that we found was an age difference in the diabetic group, but that could be just related to recruitment bias. So that brings us to the question is, how much wild food would a community need to be able to sustain energy metabolism? Because that wild food, if it's key, we got to make sure that there's enough wild food coming around to be able to get it. So we know if we look at a community, so the big advantage we have as a researcher is that community is an isolated entity. We know what's coming in because it's being flown in. If we can figure out how much land-based food is coming in, and we know the energy demand of the community, and I'll show you some of that data. I just did the calculations on this. If you estimate the energy requirement of the community at the basal level as low as you can, this could give you an indication of how much food you need in terms of calories. So the question becomes, how much land-based food is needed to support energy expenditure of the community, of the entire community? So that took me a while, by the way, and I had Sylvia Santosa helping me, and I had a lot of people looking at this. So you see all the references, because I don't really trust equations. So I kind of double-checked all the equations. And so anyway, if you have any concerns or questions on this, don't hesitate to ask me, because I worked really hard on this. So I used the census data, and the census data gives me an idea of the proportion of the different age groups. Based on that proportion, I used growth curve for kids to figure out their body weight and height, and then figured out their energy expenditure. In adults, we had data, and we compared it to data from the lab to make sure that we had obese adults with the same for the same height and weight and BMI. So we actually, this data is adjusted for lab stuff. So anyway, any questions on this? Don't hesitate. So I come up that on average, an individual is 1,461 kilocalories per day. So that's sedentary. That's somebody that's not moving around. You're sedentary, because I'm looking for the lowest value. The community is at 652 megacalories per day. And on a yearly basis, 234 gigacalories per year. I don't know if you've ever seen these units, but anyway, it's a lot of calories. If we base our calculations on a macronutrient profile of the diet with 15% protein, 30% fat, and 55%, again, thinking of hunter-gatherers, the protein should be much higher. But once you see the numbers, you're gonna go, man, if it's much higher, they're gonna deplete the entire resource. So keep in mind, I'm going for the lowest estimate right now. On a yearly basis, based on these calculations, I would need 30 tons of carbohydrates to feed the community, 7,000 tons of fat, and 7,000 tons of protein. If we look at the calculations based on what people are able to catch, so this is within Wapakika. On the right-hand side, you can see all the different species that are caught within the community. We collected the data to make sure that we could figure out the percentages coming from each animal. And you can see moose is a big fraction of these animals. And in yellow, what you can see is to sustain just protein intake at 15%, you would need on a yearly basis 33 moose, 105 beaver, 6 caribou, 365 rabbit, tons of birds, and tons of fish. And these would need to be caught, because these communities are isolated communities, would need to be caught within the radius of this community. So this would represent a strain on species living around this community of 65% on fish, 5% on birds, and 30% on mammals. So one thing we need to remember is when we look at these birds, only partridge is not migratory. Canada geese is migratory and ducks are migratory. 1 year, they didn't pass through. So they actually had to chase them somewhere else to be able to pick them up. Okay? Caribou rarely come around, and because of climate change, I haven't been able to move on certain lakes. So just keep in mind that these values are humongous, and this is just for 15% of the required energy expenditure. So is this sustainable? Is this viable within these communities? What would be the environmental impact of these hunting activities? What is the cost? What is the energy? What is the equipment? Do people have the necessary knowledge and understand risks? Within Wapakika, I would trust 6 to 8 hunters to survive this type of intensity of hunting and fishing. There's tremendous risks of going on the land, and I can tell you from going over slush on an open, on a lake with a skidoo, that there's tremendous risk when you're going hunting in the winter, and there is tremendous risk because you're very isolated within these communities. One way to look at how much people are getting is to actually ask them. So we tried this a few times in different communities, but land-based food yields are amazingly difficult to determine. But even if they weren't, you can see the proportion right now, but people have reported it's less than 1% of the protein requirement coming from wild food. So activities would need to be amazingly increased to be able to sustain the necessary wild food. So to conclude, I'm going to put all of this together. What do we know about food access in remote First Nation communities of Ontario, keeping in mind that I'm talking about northern communities of Ontario? This might be totally different in other communities. The greatest food source by far for these communities is junk food and highly processed food. We need a strategy to replace these food by more nutritious foods. There's very low availability in nutritious foods, and the price is ridiculous, and it's not being subsidized. We need a strategy to increase access to these foods and reduce the cost. The solution that everyone's been talking about is let's go to the land and let's try to get food from the land. Can this provide enough energy to sustain energy expenditure? Based on these calculations, it would still be a very small portion. Could we find strategies to avoid affecting or depleting the resource? And as a biologist, one thing I can tell you, if a fish is being overfished, there will be no more fish at some point. So you're going to go further and further to be able to get that resource. A moose requires a lot of territory to grow. So we need strategies to reduce the cost of harvesting. Gas costs $5 a liter, and it's probably higher now because of the gas tax. So I'm thinking it's probably going to be at $6 a liter this year. So the cost of getting on the land for each animal being caught is tremendous. Probably even higher than what you would pay for nutritious foods, and definitely way higher than what you would pay for junk food. So I'd like to thank the Wapakika Band Council and Casablanca Band Council, are the participants. We've been there for 15 years in these communities, and people are amazing. They've taken amazing initiatives. There's been numerous undergrad and grad students, and my mentor, Francois Perronnet, who I can always run numbers through, and he always tells me if they're right or wrong. So any questions, don't hesitate.
So it is 9:30, but you're more than welcome to stay and ask questions to Dr. Haman and any of our other speakers as well. Any questions? Or Christy?
So you talked about the 33 moose would be required to sustain that community as long as the other things. How many moose would this community see in a season?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, because we always ask that question, and we get no answer. So people are not that, open about telling you the exact number, especially for moose, and telling you where they got the moose for good reasons. Anybody that's been hunting knows exactly why. Don't get in my territory. So what we've kind of learned through the branches is maybe they could see 40 moose in total a year, but people are concerned that that's even too much. So again, the territory needed to sustain a moose is humongous. So you need to go extremely far to go pick up these moose. So it might be 40 moose one year, but it might be down to 10 moose the next year. So these numbers, going anywhere higher would be impossible. The fish numbers are ridiculous. There's no way they can pick up that many fish within the lakes that are around the community. So we got to remember that these people were nomadic, right? So they used to move with the resource. And they were put on reserve in 1905. Well, when they were put on reserve, the purpose was not to make sure they could live on the land. So this is amazingly challenging to them. So the numbers at 33, amazingly challenging.
Okay. So one of the questions I've always thought of is why don't they adopt more agriculture, like raising domestic animals or greenhouses and that types of thing?
So that's a very good question, and we're kind of looking into it now. So we actually develop greenhouses, that type of stuff. We've got to remember that fruits and vegetables are amazingly important, very low in calories. So you still need a basic amount of fat and basic amount of protein to be able to sustain life in these communities. So they are moving towards agriculture, but culturally, it's not something that's done on a grand scale. The other issue is very little light. Growing season is very, very short. So now we're looking into species of plants that can actually grow much easier in that climate. Potatoes. So we've been growing potatoes like crazy. So, but again, potatoes have their limits, so we're trying to diversify some of this resource. The kids love it, by the way. They got tower gardens in the schools now. And the kids have been loving it, but it's still not enough to feed the community.
Okay. I'd like to thank all our speakers and invite you to the networking and coffee break in the main area. Thank you.